What's up guys, Sean here, and today we're going to talk about Cenk Uygur getting sued, because there's an update. So I already made a video about this. I'll leave a link in the description if you guys want to watch it so you can get my initial reaction. But to give you the abridged version, I was very skeptical of this lawsuit when it first came out. And the reason I was skeptical is because Andrew Jones, the complainant in the lawsuit, put out a very sketchy fact pattern. He claimed all three of these things were true. That he wasn't hired because he was black, that he was hired because he was black as like a token, and that he was fired because he was black. Now, to me, when you label somebody a racist, no matter what action they take, that seems pretty suspicious. But that's not what this video is about. We have a new update. Andrew Jones actually released a video statement, and that's what I want to get into. And we're going to see whether or not my suspicions about him were correct or not.
Yesterday, I came forward about the racial discrimination that I unfortunately dealt with at the Young Turks. In response, my old boss, Cenk Uygur, insinuated that I lied. He couldn't be more wrong. When I went to Cenk for help, he responded by telling me his old boss would tell me to shut the up and I should just deal with it. He also told me complaining about my discrimination complaints was something amounting to a fireable offense.
Okay, so this is actually really interesting because in my initial video response, I said that I didn't believe that Cenk Uygur just up and told Andrew Jones that complaining about discrimination was a firing offense. And now I have a little bit of confirmation of my original hypothesis in Jones's statement here. You see, according to the complaint that Jones filed with the New York State Human Rights Commission, he only spoke to Cenk Uygur about his discrimination one time. And in this video, he quite clearly states that when Cenk told him about how he was feeling discriminated against, that Cenk told him a story about how his old boss would react to a discrimination lawsuit. Then after or during that story, he's not really clear on which, he said that filing for discrimination was a firing offense. Now, considering that in the complaint that Jones filed with the New York State Human Rights Commission, he said it was one conversation and it was a very brief conversation, I'm going to assume that this was a part of the story that Cenk was telling. And if this was a part of the story that Cenk was telling about his old boss, then I definitely believe that Cenk said it in that context. But the context is everything. And the reason I say that is because that's how almost every Young Turks video ever goes. They start by talking about a news story, but eventually it goes into like a personal story about one of the members of the Young Turks' personal life. And I've actually heard Cenk Uygur on air tell stories about how he worked for somebody when he was in his corporate lawyer phase that was a fan of the Confederacy. And if I had to bet on it, I'd say that the guy that Cenk was talking about was that former employer. But this is one of the reasons why I say wait for more details and wait for more context, because context really matters. Cenk Uygur is a guy who will randomly go into personal stories on air, so I'm not surprised that he would do that in a phone call. And with that in mind, something that sounds like a clear and open threat in isolation, in context, is part of a bigger story.
The Young Turks started their brand writing about African Americans in horrible terms. Their head of HR, Dave Koehler, wrote about black people in old blog post discovered last month, quote, "Poor black people sweating in the sun." That was the same person who investigated my complaints by talking to me on the phone only once about my discriminatory complaints against my supervisor and never talking to me again about what the investigation he conducted resulted in.
Alright, so in this part of the video, he starts getting into the old blog post that Cenk Uygur and Dave Koehler wrote about 18 years ago, before the current machination of the Young Turks even existed. We've already gone over these in the past, and basically these were written in jest. They were written a really long time ago, and Cenk has already apologized for it. But the reason it's being brought up in this video is A, because the racial discrimination claims, in my opinion, are just not that strong, and B, it's an old lawyer trick to try and get negative media attention against somebody you're suing, so that way they're more willing to settle. Don't get me wrong, in court, this would probably be brought up to show a pattern of behavior, but really, it's two very far apart data points. I'm sorry, but if I'm the judge or the jury in this case, Dave Koehler nearly 20 years ago writing about African Americans that are poor and calling them po blacks instead of poor blacks is not enough to show a pattern of discrimination. Like seriously, if you're that racially sensitive that somebody using Ebonics to say the word poor offends you, then I don't know what to do with you, man. Like, the world is a much tougher place than that. And again, this was 20 years ago. I don't see how it impacts your case whatsoever. I understand that Koehler is the head of HR now, but this is not a pattern of behavior. These are two separate data points. He also brings up another separate data point from back in the day. Apparently, Cenk and Dave set off a bottle rocket at the Martin Luther King Jr. Museum.
And both Cenk and David Koehler joined themselves in shooting bottle rockets at the Martin Luther King Memorial. All those past actions, both Cenk and Dave Koehler never apologized for until they were called out in press last month. So it's not shocking that when I needed help to have my claims of discrimination fully investigated, that there was no help to be found.
Now, they didn't do it at the museum. They actually did it at the parking lot of the museum. But the reason that this is considered really crass is because the museum is located where Martin Luther King Jr. was shot and killed. So I could definitely see how setting off a bottle rocket there would be like completely not cool to do. But obviously this was done for like shock humor. Probably the most interesting thing about this is that if it were to be done today, it would be filmed and put on YouTube. This sounds like a standard insensitive YouTube prankster video. So all in all, it's not the most sensitive thing to do, but should that be relevant to the case? No. Am I offended by them setting off a bottle rocket in the parking lot of the Martin Luther King Jr. Museum? No. And I'm just not one of those people who's oversensitive enough to demand an apology for something they did a long time ago that was clearly a joke. So yeah, I think my initial gut reaction to this lawsuit was pretty accurate. I don't think there's a lot there. I think the fact pattern of the case shows that the Young Turks is a progressive media outlet that draws people who are super sensitive about race. This guy felt that he was discriminated against when he wasn't initially hired. Despite the fact that he felt initially discriminated against, he ended up taking the job when they found the funds to hire him. So he ended up working there. And then he felt discriminated against while he was working there. And if you read the complaint, he's upset because he feels like he had more experience than even the person who was supervising him. And of course, because the person who supervised him was a white person, he read race into that situation where I just don't think it was present. I mean, is it crazy for me to suggest that two people cannot get along at work and be different races, but the reason that they're not getting along could have nothing to do with the fact that they're different races? Maybe in current year that's considered a crazy statement, but I think that's the most logical explanation for what happened here. Somebody who has race on the mind, that knows that the Young Turks got a recent investment, he got fired, he's angry, and he's suing. And I think the result of this case, because it's getting media attention, will be a settlement. But just because somebody settles a discrimination case, that doesn't necessarily mean that discrimination actually occurred. They could be just trying to avoid the fees of fighting a lawsuit. Typically, even if you win a lawsuit, it's more expensive to fight it than to just settle. So yeah, I don't think that a future settlement should be used as a club to beat the Young Turks over the head. So yeah, that pretty much covers the entire update to this story. Now I want to go over some things that people were confused about from my last video on this topic. So in my last video, I said as like a throwaway line that the case that we were talking about, the Jones case, doesn't have as much merit as like the Jordan Sheridan case does. And I think what caused a lot of confusion is I made a mistake. I didn't say that that case was settled in my last video when in fact it was. Now, of course, the allegations against Jordan Sheridan were really severe. There was a sexual misconduct component and there was a misuse of company funds. But typically you don't settle out of court with somebody that you're accusing of misuse of company funds. The reason I was saying that that case had more merit was because of the settlement. And I think it's way more likely that a progressive organization that covers things like the Me Too movement nonstop might have quickly tried to fire somebody without dotting their I's and crossing their T's because they don't want backlash from the progressive community. Another thing that confused people, despite the fact that it was explained in the pinned comment, is that when I said Andrew Jones in the last video, I showed a picture of the former Major League Baseball player and I said former Gold Glove winning center fielder Andrew Jones. And I made a joke about how it was weird that the Young Turks hired a former baseball player as a journalist. Now, this confused a lot of people, and I understand why, because I didn't mention that after Andrew Jones won all those Gold Gloves at center field, later in his career, he actually played other outfield positions. So I'm genuinely sorry that you guys felt that I misinformed you by showing Andrew Jones's picture and not mentioning that he played other positions in the outfield. Like, how could I do that? He also played for other teams besides the Atlanta Braves. Like, that's a thing that happened. and that's relevant. And I didn't show Andrew Jones's picture as a joke at all. This guy is actually the same person, even though he doesn't look like the same person in the video. He's actually the same person, even though the name Andrew Jones, the baseball player's name, it's spelled differently than Andrew Jones, the journalist. They're the same person. It wasn't a joke about how they have the same name, and I wasn't referencing baseball, which is like my favorite sport. Like that wasn't happening at all. You guys were totally right about the Andrew Jones thing. Thank you for including that in your comments multiple times, that Andrew Jones is from South America and he's not actually black. Thank you for that. I really needed that cleared up by you guys. Wasn't a joke at all. Anyway, that's all I really have for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you like this video, then please show me by leaving a like. You can subscribe for more content. You can actually support me on Patreon, PayPal, and Maker support. This has been me updating you on the Cenk Uygur lawsuit. Till next time.